Okay, guys, welcome back to the fourth key knowledge dot point of this first outcome of Unit 2. And today we're talking about policies and procedures. So the usual look at where this fits into our study design for the outcome. Now we can see the need for policies and procedures to achieve compliance with legal requirements and establish business routines. So let's start off with just a couple of definitions, one for policies, one for procedures. Policies, basically written statements that outline the expected performance and behaviour of your employees. And procedures is a series of actions employees must follow when abiding by a business policy. Okay, so basically we start with a policy, and the procedures is kind of the series of steps behind that policy that kind of detail how that business is going to implement or carry out that policy. So we start with a policy, and that leads on to the procedures that explain how we're going to do that policy. Hopefully that makes sense. Why do we need them? Basically to ensure consistency and stability in the business operations. So, particularly as the business grows in size and there's more people involved, more employees, we want people to be doing the same things, same behaviors in similar situations, we want some stability and consistency. That kind of makes sense. And the other reason, to make sure that we're being legally compliant. So definitely two aspects of why we need a solid set of policies backed up by procedures. Let's start with policies. Two places that these can actually originate from. They can originate from legislation, law, that must be followed, and that will affect all businesses. Some legislation affects all businesses. Some will affect businesses operating in a certain industry or a type of business, of course. So, there's, for example, this food legislation, which would obviously only apply to businesses dealing with food, or they can be internal policies. And these would be created by individual businesses, and they apply to only that particular business. So just some examples of both types to give you an idea. An example of an internal policy might be a dress code, okay? That outlines the expected workwear for employees. Our school uniform policy is an example of that. That little graphic there, I quite like that. Obviously, that's obviously reflecting on 2019 moving to 2020 COVID and working from home, where people, were dressing up for the office, and suddenly, they were working from home and they ended up basically working in PJs. So yeah, I quite like that little graphic there. Another example of an internal policy would be customer service policy. So, particularly large businesses, they'll have a certain way they, like to deal with customers. And these policies would outline how the employees behave or interact with their customers. Kind of makes sense. Internet and email use policies outline, obviously, how employees are allowed to use the business's internet connection and network appropriately, and how emails can be used. And social media policies, again, it outlines expectations of how employees are expected to act on social media. And look, that's an interesting one, because obviously social media is part of your private life. But still, particularly people with levels of responsibility within a business, it can be a big issue if, on your social media, you kind of look like a bit of a tool, basically, and it can come back and bite you in the workplace. So some businesses actually have policies around people's use of social media, even though that isn't necessarily all within the workplace. Legislation derived, again, there's an endless amount of this, just a few examples. Occupational health and safety. Basically, every business must comply with the OH&S laws in their state. So in Victoria, we have the OH&S Act 2004. Basically, what this says, it's a huge piece of legislation and there's a lot of documentation behind this. But as a business operator, you have a legal responsibility to protect the health and safety of your employees whilst they're at work. That responsibility actually also extends to visitors to your business premises as well. For the time being, we kind of don't need any more than that, but you'll understand that concept, I think, particularly if you have a job yourself, you will be aware of the OH&S kind of requirements in your workplace. Australian consumer law, this is one of my favourites, and I've talked to some of you in class about this. In Australia, we're quite lucky to have this piece of legislation. Australian Consumer Law, ACL 2011. And the idea here is this is designed to stop and prohibit exploitative business behaviours. It covers areas such as misleading advertising, consumer protection, contracts, that sort of stuff. And it actually stipulates a whole bunch of stuff that as the business operator, you must kind of adhere to. So you're not allowed to give half truths in advertising. You're not allowed to suggest a product has attributes that it does not. You can't state that a product is made in one country if it's made in another. You have to use logos, names, or you can't use, logos, names, packaging, etc. that is similar to other well-known brands. You can't use false or misleading labels. You can't offer gifts or prizes with no intention of ever supplying them. And you cannot engage in bait advertising, which is when you advertise a good, mass marketing campaign, but there's actually only a few of those available. And then other people have to buy maybe a more expensive alternative. Next one, equal opportunity. This is around recruitment and how you kind of deal with your employees in the workspace. So this is all about protecting people from discrimination and harassment in all areas of public life, but this also includes the workplace. So as a business, you have to have clear policies that comply with this legislation. And it covers things such as your recruitment processes, unfair terms of employment, access to training, access to promotion opportunities, and unfair dismissal. Food Act, I just mentioned before, food businesses. Food Act 1984, this safeguards Victorians from purchasing food that is unsafe to eat. So again, business owners, if you have food within your business, are responsible for food safety within your premises. You've got to ensure that all staff that come into contact with food are fully trained, and you need to have policies in place to make sure that all of this stuff gets adhered to on a daily basis. So if you work in a food business, if you work at Macca's or something, you might have posters such as this dotted around the kitchen. I mean, this is one example, but there are others, just to remind you constantly of kind of the rules, the regulations around various aspects of food handling. This is part of this idea of, if we go back, policies put in place to make sure this stuff gets adhered to on a daily basis. So one of the ways you can prove that is by putting these sort of things around the business. So it's constant reminders for the staff of what they should be doing. Now, another aspect of this, we're now kind of looking at procedures, but we're going to kind of lump policies and procedures really together there because, the policy is the start of the procedure. It's important to review your policies and your procedures, okay? So procedures are designed to encourage employees to behave in a consistent manner, ensure they remain legally compliant. Remember, they're based on a particular policy. So what they do is kind of give employees this step-by-step guide to follow in specific situations or types of events. So again, the starting point is that policy on which the procedure is based. Now, the reality is that policies change from time to time. So for example, there might be a change in the law. So it's really, really important that all policies and procedures constantly reviewed to ensure that they're still relevant, they're still valid, and they kind of help the business avoid falling foul of the law in any way. Okay, so hopefully that kind of makes some sense. The law is not a static thing. Okay, when we actually looked at a couple of those laws previously, so Australian Consumer Law 2011, there was another one which was from 2004. That doesn't mean the law hasn't changed since then. The fundamental law stays the same. If you do legal studies, you'll understand this, but they make amendments constantly to them. So it's really, really important that you're aware of any changes in legislation so you can update those policies to reflect those changes. So here's something that you're going to need, a policy and procedure review process. So the idea here, this is just something you can kind of have operating in the background and you apply to all of your policies and procedures. And it's a process that you can go through to make sure all of this stuff stays up to date, basically. So step one, analyze and assess all of your current relevant policies, both internal and external. Management then need to create procedures that reinforce those policies. So remember the step-by-step ways in which we're going to actually implement that policy. Management then need to present and implement the policy and the procedure across the entire business. And then the policy and procedures associated with it need to be reviewed and changed as necessary. So, for example, you might do this on an annual basis. Okay, some of them might need to be done more often, some of them less often. It depends on the type of policy we're talking about. But you might have built into the way that you operate your business that every 12 months we review all of our food handling practices, and we'll go back and make sure that everything, all of the procedures and the policies we have within our business are meeting the current legislation that is out there, particularly if there's been any updates to that legislation in the previous 12 months. Okay, so the idea of that step 4 is for this to be done on a regular basis, and how regular kind of depends on what we're talking about. And that is all we need to talk about for policies and procedures, guys. So I shall see you in the next Key Knowledge dot point for the final one, Key Knowledge 5. I'll see you then. Cheers for now.